Hey, how's everybody doing? This is Mr. Arvites again with another coronavirus lesson. This one is going to be on Benito Mussolini and the rise of Italian fascism in the 1920s and 30s. So I think, again, very important lesson when you talk about World War II in general, in any type of class, U.S. history, world history, European history, because you need to know how these guys get into power to understand what they're actually doing and why they're doing it. Now, Benito Mussolini, much like Hitler, is just this kind of guy who just appears on the global stage. He's a nobody before the war. But if you look, and if you look at the Italian flag at the time, the one that Mussolini kind of liked the most, is they have about 4 of them that go on during his time, you're going to have that eagle standard, right, from the Roman Empire. And Mussolini is a throwback nationalist, okay? So almost romanticism in a way. Mussolini believes that the Roman Empire should be relived, and it should be relived under Italian fascism. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. Now, Mussolini, prior to World War I, it's kind of interesting because he's actually a socialist, borders on communism, but then he kind of falls away from that the early part of the 20th century. And then going into World War I, he's ultra-nationalistic, and he believes that the Italian people need to put forth in World War I and they need to commit. And he's really bitter towards communists because communists protest World War I almost across the board. Another reason why Hitler hated communists as well. And Mussolini, just like him, is going to hate them for those reasons. Now, Mussolini in World War I is a soldier in the Italian front against the Austrians and Germans. And so he does suffer some wounds, and he's actually in a hospital right around when the war ends. And that's the worst place you could be in, right? People are miserable in those World War I hospitals. Their survival rate isn't very high. Infection seeps in, and depression really does seep in. Now, Mussolini discovers that he is a fantastic, charismatic speaker, and he is. And it's crazy because quite often when we talk about World War II, most people just think of Hitler, and they're like, oh yeah, Hitler is the only major speaker in the war. No, Mussolini is just as good of a speaker as Hitler. Now, we could argue Mussolini is way more egotistical when he speaks than Hitler. Hitler tends to use words like we. Mussolini is generally talking I, me. I am the reason why we're doing these things. And so Mussolini is going to be that type of a person. Now, as the war ends, Mussolini is going to rally in the various places that he is against the Italian government. And he says the government failed us in the war. Very similar to Adolf Hitler with the stab in the back theory, almost a mirror image. Now, the thing that Mussolini also generates is a group called the Black Shirts. This Black Shirts are going to actually transform eventually into his private army. And eventually they'll be the only Italian soldiers fighting in the war toward the end of it. But these Black Shirts are going to be loyal to Mussolini, and they are former soldiers who believe the government kind of messed over the Italian people. They believe communism was to blame. And there's a lot of foreigners that are kind of coming into Italy at this time too. And Italy did not take kindly to those foreigners. So fascism, the question becomes, what is fascism? And a lot of people kind of start talking about, well, what side does it fall on? Is it a left philosophy? Is this part of like communism, socialism in there? Or is this a right philosophy? Is this a conservative movement? I tend to say fascism is far more conservative. It deals heavy in nationalism. It deals heavy in cultural traditions. We talked about Hitler, right? Wanting that German family where the wife didn't have to work. You have the 2 kids, and you have the dad who has enough to provide for the family. Mussolini said that as well. Almost all fascism is going to rise off of poverty, right? They're going to preach for economic development. And fascism tends to coincide with a lot of industrialization and a lot of military production. So it's a nationalistic movement. And I think it's almost hard to put it on that political spectrum because of that. Are there some socialist policies in there? And some people are going to say, well, they do socialize some parts of the economy. Well, so does the United States, right? But what they do is they do a large number of government contracts for military production. And that's going to be where Mussolini kind of does his thing. He's also going to industrialize that southern Italy part, or at least try to, which hadn't happened yet. And so that's going to be one of the things that makes him successful. Now, how does Mussolini get in power? That's the better thing. Well, Mussolini, he gets in power by very corrupt means, and then by somewhat legal / corrupt means. He and the Black Shirts are going to march. They're going to march on Rome. And when they march on Rome, he will eventually be named to the head of government. And when he's named to the head of government, that's really cool. But he's not necessarily completely in charge yet. There are still opposition parties. There's a liberal party. You have a socialist party in Italy. You have a conservative party in Italy. And so as Mussolini progresses into 1924 and then eventually 1925, they're going to have a couple of referendum elections that are more or less rigged that say Mussolini is now in charge. In 1925, he is going to control all of the legislature, and he's going to suspend all opposition parties. So the only political party in Italy is going to be fascism. Again, this is a mirror image of what Hitler does a decade later, because Hitler does it in 1934 and 35. He does it in 1924 and 1925. And so Italy under Mussolini is going to begin to rise out of that impoverished state of World War I. They do miss out on some of the depressions, which makes Mussolini fairly popular. They use scapegoats in the forms of foreigners, and they kick a lot of foreigners out of Italy during this time. But there's also, in all fascism, there is an expansionist mindset, and Mussolini is just the same. He believes that Italy must expand, and basically war is the state. Like, you have to have war to have a state. And so to have an empire, to have this be an Italian empire, he will preach that they need to invade places. And so they'll look at Libya, and they'll look at eventually into Somalia, and eventually an invasion of Ethiopia. They will fight a war in Ethiopia, actually, to contain it. And so Mussolini is going to be this expansionist guy. Now, what made him so popular in Italy at the time? I mean, he got things done, right? He got things accomplished, and more people were working. And so maybe it's some economic luck. Maybe it's because when you're pulling all the strings, it's a lot easier to make decisions. So that's something to keep in mind. Like, a dictator can make a lot of decisions really, really quickly, while a legislature has to debate over it. And so he got results done, but he did so by suspending rights. And so he suspended the rights of a lot of different people. He got rid of opposition media almost entirely. There's a lot of propaganda in there. One of the greatest stories I think I've ever heard about Mussolini is a story in Rome, right? So Mussolini is kind of sitting in his office, and he did not like loud noises because of various things in the First World War. And so there was an ordinance downtown that you could not honk your horn. And there's this big traffic jam, right, in downtown Rome. If you've ever been to Italy, these very, very narrow streets. And so there's a traffic jam, and this guy's kind of leaning on his horn, and Mussolini kind of looks at him, and he gets up. His bodyguards follow him. He taps on the guy's windshield. Guy rolls it down. He shoots him in the head. And then he hangs him he has his men, rather, hang him from a street sign, basically saying no honking in the government district. And, that story is kind of cruel and horrible, but it also shows you how powerful he was. He could literally murder a guy in broad daylight and nothing would happen to him. That's how powerful Benito Mussolini is going to be. Now, Mussolini, as we get into the 1930s, is going to look to expand his power. One of the things that he's also going to do in 1936, he's going to make an alliance with Hitler, right? The Pact of Steel. Now, the Pact of Steel was actually for them to literally get steel from Germany. And it's an economic treaty, but also a military treaty. Mussolini will also assist in the Spanish Civil War. He'll assist Franco, the fascist that was fighting in that civil war. And so Mussolini will go into there. Now, the other big thing that he does, remember that the country is nothing without conquest, Benito Mussolini. That's his big quote. And they called him El Duce, right? The leader. And so El Duce believed that he wouldn't be a leader until they actually invaded someplace. So in 1938, they are going to invade Ethiopia. This is going to be a 6-month war. Some people talk about how it was fairly mishandled, and the Italians tended to mishandle their wars for whatever reason. They just kind of did. And so Mussolini invades Ethiopia. They win a 6-month war over that. The British and the French are kind of upset about it, but the irony is that they use the Suez Canal, so the British kind of let them get there anyway. But Mussolini is going to take over Ethiopia going into that 1938 time period. Now, he kind of he knows that Hitler's kind of proposing various degrees of war. Mussolini wants to stay out of World War II at the beginning. He's going to get involved in it when Germany invades France. And a lot of people kind of criticize Mussolini, especially Germans at the time, because he doesn't invade France until really France is surrendering in 1940. And then he invades from the south. But Mussolini's going to try and pick off British territory all across that northern African area. So Mussolini, why is he important? Why is this guy someone there? Well, because he presents a different front in the war. The Italian front, which we'll talk about later in a different lecture, is one of the most violent fronts of the entire war. It's very, very hard fought, and it really did kind of bleed the American and British armies down in 1943, 44, and then 45. It's one of the longest standing fronts of the entire war. So that's, I think, very important. The other part is to know that Hitler gets a lot of his ideas, the black shirts inspire the SA, right? The brown shirts. Him having his own secret police inspire the Gestapo. Him having the black shirts become his private army is what the SS becomes, right? These are the most loyal fascists, if you will. The other thing that Mussolini did, and he did very effectively, was completely change public schooling, which we know Hitler did as well. And so a lot of those things are gotten from Mussolini, and he is kind of the father of that fascist movement that takes place in Central Europe at this time. So I think that that's really, really important to kind of understand. And the other thing is it gave Hitler a natural ally in the middle of Europe. And I think that was really, really important kind of for Hitler going forward. Now, as we kind of look on, a lot of people are going to criticize Mussolini's kind of like the dictator who screws up a lot. The Germans don't necessarily like him that much, and he tends to really just mess up a whole bunch, or the Italian army seems to. Invasions in Greece didn't go very well. Eastern Europe is a disaster. Albania is not a very good invasion. When they go into Africa, Hitler has to send soldiers in Africa to bail them out. But that's more or less Mussolini. Again, he's the guy you should know about just because you should know about who the other leaders are, but he's not the most important, right? In the next lesson, what we're going to talk about is Tojo, and I think he's a lot more important because we're going to talk about how he facilitates Pearl Harbor and a number of other things. But until next time, see you later, guys.